a tiny little story, but I've just finished 10 days of an experiment for our next program on bread. And I'm still wearing one of these,
Oh,
glucose
CGMs. Yeah.
monitors on my arm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Natalie Donovan and I, the producer, have been eating a series of supermarket breads and seeing what happened to our blood sugar. In fact, it wasn't that remarkable because both Natalie and I turn out to have very good glucose. We can metabolize it really well. So, I got quite sick 2 days on this bread, and but on the last day, we both decided we would eat the highest quality bread we could get in our neighborhoods. So I bought a sourdough loaf made from einkorn wheat, and I had 100 grams, just like we had with all the other stuff. And I ate it dry, just like the other stuff. And I felt great, and I wasn't hungry for 4 hours. That was my breakfast at 8:30 in the morning. And I wasn't actually that hungry at lunchtime. It was like, yes, quality, it's not yield. You can make 1,000,000 loaves of that white slice stuff, but it won't feed you. Those 2 slices of bread fed me. They were food. And we've got confused about this. Michael Pollan calls them food-like substances. And they are food-like substances. They're not food. And we've got to think less about yield and more about what we're growing.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
What are we going to talk about?
What are we going to talk about?
Yeah.
I was thinking about this because we could either do it chronologically, like looking at your career, but I think that's kind of sort of the standard way in which people would conduct a podcast with yourself. And I actually think we should start where our sort of paths collided or crossed. It might be a better
That's
word.
a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
because that was sort of at the start of my public-facing career, I guess, and you'd already done a couple of episodes, I think, on the link between health and food, given your own experience. Why don't we start there? Actually, when did you get interested in the concept of food and health and how we can utilize nutrition as a means to prevent conditions as well as support treatments and therapy?
I think there was a sort of background to it, just the way I was brought up, and I was still part of that. I'm old, and I was still part of that culture as a child of food being used when you were ill. My mother made beef tea. That was just sort of the culture. It was obvious that you could give people food and it would make them feel better. Um, but but I think thinking coherently about it began when there was a study came out, and it must have been in the early 90s, which showed that that societies with high levels of vegetable and fruit consumption had less cancers. It seems bleeding obvious to us now, but anyway, this study came out, and I thought, well, that's interesting. It sort of fulfills it. It says what I think is obvious, but here it is documented. It was an epidemiological study, and I said to myself, well, what would be the effect then of a diet high in fruit and vegetables with people who'd had cancer and we're trying to keep off it returning. So we decided to make a food program about that, asking that question. And we rang, we identified the main cancer hospitals in Britain, and we we tried to find people who could talk to us, and we were met with derision. It was considered an absurd idea, completely absurd. And I thought, well, that's amazing, isn't it? Why would you dismiss that as absurd when you've just seen this other study? It was dismissed because it was epidemiological and, not double blind. And, as we now know, those kind of tests are absurd in that world. But anyway, that was really the beginning of seeing how people involved in the world of cancer thought it was silly. And then, so that was one step. Then my sister got breast cancer in her early 40s. And it was a small cell, it wasn't a tumor. It was small cell. It was considered, terminal, actually. And she
Mm.
lives in Northern California. And, she was, very Northern Californian. And but she worked in the hospital. She's an occupational therapist working with people with extreme, bad strokes, AIDS, really. Anyway, she did some research and she decided that, contrary to her medical advice, she wasn't going to have chemotherapy, and
Mm.
she had a double mastectomy, and we were all her family, mom and dad and me, were just so shocked by this. And she consulted a cancer nutritionist, and regardless of what everybody said, including her doctors, which was that she was signing her death warrant, she did it. She didn't have chemo, and she did eat, and she did do this thing with supplements, um, and she's now in her 60s, and she's absolutely fine. Um,
Wow.
I mean, as you know, one case proves nothing,
Yeah.
but it was incredibly brave of her because, I mean, her doctors were writing her off, you'll be dead. And so that, made me think. And then I got cancer, God damn it. And I got multiple myeloma. And I thought, am I going to be as brave as my sister? And I thought, no, I'm not going to be as brave as my sister, because multiple myeloma, is your bone marrow, and it's this. And my husband did a lot of research, and I ended up under the care of Professor Jamie Kavanagh at Bart's, and he was very open-minded. And I mean, I've had all the conventional. I mean, I went on a trial, and I've had the conventional chemotherapy treatments, but I did try and apply everything that I've learned about the role of food, and the role of relaxation and meditation and all those things. But it was real, because I didn't ask him how long I'd got, but my husband did, and he said, well, it's usually about 5 years, and then it was 7 years, and I may drop dead tomorrow, but it's getting on for 11 years now.
Mm.
And there's a really excellent book that you probably know by David Servan Schreiber called, what's it called? Cancer. Oh
Anti-cancer.
God, I can't. Anti-cancer. And that puts together what we know. And what I realized when I was doing this for myself, for my own health, my own survival, is that you just have to be intelligent, because you have to be thoughtful. You have to look at the animal studies. You have to look at the laboratory studies, because there are very few human studies, because, A, they very difficult to do. B, there isn't a lot of money to be made out of discovering that mushroom powder, will help your immune system. And we have a system, we have a medical system. I mean, you were trained in it. It has technical brilliance. It has many marvels, but it's terribly, terribly narrow. And I read about one of the things. I'll stop soon. But one of the things I'd read when I got sick was about this study that had been done at the MD Anderson Center in Texas, at Cancer Research Center, about curcumin, the active part
Mm.
of what's it called, turmeric.
Turmeric.
And so I told Professor Kavanagh about this, and it turned out he had another of his patients who was taking high doses, who actually, I mean, he ended up writing about it in the BMJ. She came back from, when all the options for treating her multiple myeloma ran out. She did this high dose of curcumin and went back to normality. So he says, this needs more study, but, it hasn't been done. Anyway, so when I met you, that's why there was this startling, there was this doctor trained in this, in the system, who was saying, look, this all these other elements make a profound difference to your chances of recovery, to your chances of not getting these sick. They're not miracles. You can't eat turmeric and wacko, your cancer's gone. But, well, that's your story, isn't it, Rupy? And you
Yeah.
came to the kitchen and, and talked about this. And, from the day, from the week we were making that program, I can't remember what year, whatever year it was, ringing at a cancer specialist, to now, there's been a big, big change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible how influential the food program has been to not just a health and food conversation, but multiple conversations. Everything from sugar to GMOs to celebrating baking to the heritage of bread, grains, like all these different spokes of a wheel, all centered around food, and that's why I think it's people's one of Radio 4's most successful programs anyway. But you've really spearheaded a number of things, and I remember that episode so clearly. It was a real pivotal part of my sort of public speaking career, I guess, if you can call it that. The
Really?
the sort of the picture painted in people's heads of a doctor in the kitchen. I believe it was a rabbi. It was Levi Roots,
Yes.
and then the whole
Rabbi
show.
Laura. Yeah.
It was fab. It was incredible. He was doing, I think it was Jewish penicillin, and then Levi Roots is obviously talking about his cultural heritage and the medicinal properties. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of the sort of concepts of food as medicine or nutritional medicine, whatever people want to call it, are really steeped in something that our ancestors have sort of known intuitively or tested in their own ways. And I think modern medicine is catching up in a lot of ways. I wanted to go back slightly actually, and just if I may talk a bit about your sister and what kind of spurred her to buck the trend. You said she was very sort of North Carolina, California rather.
Northern California, not Carolina. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
What yeah, why did she sort of go in a different direction? What were her influences?
Well, I think it's because she'd been working in the hospital system there for quite a long time, and she'd seen some pretty bad things in people with cancer and the effects of chemotherapy. And she already knew that this treatment she was being offered was not going to, the doctors were not claiming this would cure her. They were claiming it would give her a longer life.
Hmm.
And she thought, do I want to put my, well, she's given to drama. Maybe I'm given to drama too. But she said, I'm not going to let them poison me. I'm not going to be poisoned. I'm going to try and build my body so that to
Hmm.
fight whatever it is that's going on. And it was her experience of being in a hospital, of seeing cancer wards, she just decided she did not want to go through that. And
Yeah,
she was going to
yeah,
try this other way. And,
yeah,
she grew up like me. We grew up in the countryside. We same experience, same also, I think, skepticism about authority and established systems. Like, really? Do they know all this?
yeah. Because
That's how we were
your
brought.
your sort of early career is steeped in activism, right? I mean, you've spoken about pesticides in the soil and big pharma, big food. I think there was a lawsuit that you were involved in early in your career,
Sexism, yes. Yeah.
sexism. Yeah,
Mm.
so your activism is sort of like coming out, and maybe it was something in, I don't know, in the water in Lancashire when you grew up, or like
Yeah, right. Maybe it was. Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, we grew up in, I don't know, certain skepticism, and also we were brought up as Roman Catholics, and just because I'm
Mm,
writing something at the minute, and a Roman Catholic childhood gives you a real sense of injustice, or it used to. I don't know if it's any better now, but you're taught that God is love, And then you see, you just see these terrible things that were going on in our childhood in the Roman Catholic school we went to, just horrible things. So,
Mm.
I think both of us were inoculated
Yeah, yeah.
against systems, which everyone said, were fine, but we could see they were not.
Yeah, yeah. And going into your own experience now, 2011, that was when you were diagnosed. You went down what some would say is the conventional route. And I'll be honest, like my experience of my own health issues back in 2009, but by now most of the listeners are probably eye rolling because I talk about it fairly often. But just because it's relevant to this conversation, I kind of knew the ramifications of not doing something about my atrial fibrillation. So, atrial fibrillation causing sticky blood, irregular heart rhythm, that can lead to strokes, that can lead to some really serious consequences if not treated appropriately. And the treatment that was being offered to me at the time was yes, medications to flip the rhythm, but also an ablation to ensure that the heart can correctly beat, so I can avoid the potential issue of having a stroke. And so I was definitely being pulled in that direction. It was my mum, who's not a medic, who pulled me in a different direction. Was like, you know what, that's fine, but you got to try some simpler interventions before you do something a little bit more drastic that has complications. There are complications with every intervention that we have, and so it's interesting to see that your sister's experience pushed her in a different direction to the one that I was going in, and maybe it was because I was quite junior at the time. I'd literally just become a doctor over 13 years ago now. So it's yeah.
Yes, it's interesting. It's very interesting that your mother was the one who said, let's try something simple
Mm,
first.
yeah.
Because, um, do you know, do you read the blogs of the former editor of the BMJ? What's his name? Smith. Let me see if I can just. There
Yeah.
was he wrote this blog recently about how we have to fix the to be more realistic about the contract between doctors and patients. Patients can't go on thinking that doctors have magic powers to fix
Mm,
everything, and doctors have to face their own the limits of their powers instead
mm,
of I don't know what you think about that, sort of they're afraid of saying, this guy is a doctor, they're afraid of saying, I can't fix everything.
yeah.
I can help, I can be a helper and give you access to these things. Do you think that's true?
I
Because I do
completely agree
I
with
do see
that.
people, yeah, really.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree with that. So Richard Smith, I just quickly
That's it. Yeah,
looked up
Richard
his
Smith.
name,
That's right. Yeah.
who was edited up until 2004. So, looking at my own experience, and also after chatting about this with colleagues at various levels of their career, we were certainly taught, evidence-based medicine, a pharmaceutical model, a lack of sort of regard for any other sort of elements that could be beneficial in both prevention and supportive medicine. But also, when you're in the hospital environment, it's very hierarchical. So you hold your consultants and your seniors in like such high regard that anything that they say is pretty much set in stone and golden. And they're very clever, educated, well-read people. But I think and I believe this is changing now, but certainly when I was going through the ranks, there is this belief that what we are capable of doing is pretty amazing, and other ways in which to treat a patient that they might be proposing to us is always going to be held in less regard. Now, I think there's more of a shared responsibility for management these days, because I think we have come to realize that patients have an intuition of what's best for them, and there's a lot of shared decision making rather than something that is coming down from the top. Because we have this funny word in medicine called compliance, and I think even the word comply, whether a patient complies with a medication or not, is steeped in sort of the old world of how we treated that doctor-patient relationship. But I believe
Yeah.
that is softening, but it has to come from medical education and a realization that we are not like mini gods. We are not like fountains of knowledge. And there's so much more that we have to learn. And I found out, on the job essentially, but I think that culture needs to start.
But that's what's so amazing about what you have done, and Rangan Chatterjee, and this group, and then of. I mean, I always find it interesting that a lot of the people in that group of doctors who are trying to change that pharmaceutical model, are from an Asian background, where my visits to India and making programs there showed me that notion that that all these other things play into health is alive and well there. It hasn't
Mm,
vanished into the past like my Lancashire childhood.
mm.
So it's not altogether surprising that your mother, when you were faced with these medical interventions, said, "Hang on a minute." It's fascinating that changed you, though.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It definitely changed. I mean, that was the catalyst to everything else. It was the catalyst to me sort of having a bit more of an inquisitive mind, doing a bit more of my own primary research for my own personal gain, and then tentatively sharing that with patients on the job, other colleagues, and it was the current encouragement of my colleagues that really led me to sort of speak out a bit and start really changing the way in which we teach doctors of tomorrow, um, and the current state of doctors. Are you going to the conference next week? Did you manage
Yes,
to?
yes, I am. Yeah,
You
yeah, I'm
are
going. Yeah,
brilliant.
yeah,
What
yeah.
so
No, I mean
you know
that's
it's incredible, what Dr. Michael Dixon has done by galvanizing and collecting a group of doctors who have shared experiences, and are trying to do things in different areas, whether it be herbalism or yoga or meditation, etc., etc. It's pretty astounding, and I think it's accelerated massively just over the last 5 years. I wonder what your opinion of that is, coming at it from both a journalist and a patient. What are your thoughts on how that's progressing?
well. I'm utterly thrilled and delighted that that things have moved so fast. I mean, I'm astounded by it, really, that it's actually happening. Um, and one of the elements of this that you know about so well, is the rise of NutriTank. The
Hmm.
students, the idea that two medical students from one university sort of thought, this is wrong. This curriculum's, sort of, there's something wrong with this. That you can, that students rise up, you and you doctor, and that you could organize so fast, and that you had such faith in yourself. I mean, I remember a conversation with you once, maybe I can't remember if it was in person or whether it was an email, but I was feeling very down about the attacks we sometimes get. The the Ben Goldacre, a science writer, a very good science writer, wrote some great books. When he was introduced to me before a recording, he said, "Ah, yes, Sheila Dillon, presenter of Radio 4's astrology program." Um, that sense that you're just a crackpot, and and you said, don't worry about it. You can't waste your energy on worrying about that. Sort of, we are the future. We're we're on the right side of history. Don't worry about it. Don't waste your time. And that's tremendously good advice. Don't waste your time. And if you're doing if you are making waves, people will react. That's the fact. They
Yeah,
will.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you shared that, because I think over the course of your career as well, you would have been criticized from all manner of sources, whether it be companies, individuals, etc., etc. And I'm sure Ben Goldacre is a great writer. I've read some of his books, but I think you're always going to get criticism, even from and I'm reading a lot of Stoicism right now, actually, and it is pretty amazing how applicable Stoicism is, something steeped in history 2,000 years ago, to today, to our social media age, to our informational highway age, to all sort of the modern worries, or worries that we believe to be modern, are actually just history repeating itself. And one of the chapters I'm reading about now, it actually is about the desire for public praise. And for a classic people pleaser like myself, it's very resonant for me. And I'm learning bit by bit. It doesn't happen overnight, but I'm learning to trust my sort of inner judgment, my inner energy, and my own sort of compass, and trying to be less distracted by the public praise of others. And I think now, given we have so many metrics to measure public praise, but we don't have as many metrics to measure actually our own inner workings of how we shouldn't be affected by public praise. That's actually something that we need to work on, I think, as a society, because it will breed stronger, more resilient personalities.
I think that's absolutely key. And I worry about, well, kids, teenagers, linked to their phones and likes, and thinking that is the measure of them, and that it's frightening, I think. How do you get to that point where you have to rest in yourself, and like a stoic, you have to see what matters, and learn to trust yourself. I mean, one of my heroes is Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course, that was 19th century, not very far back compared to the Stoics, but that's, I mean, his what he was saying, is often used by the right wing to, it's whatever you think is right. That's not what he was saying. He was saying you have to read, you have to reflect, and you have to sort of come to your own judgment. But the whole world surrounding us is one that says, your judgment doesn't count. And if there's anything I could wish about my life, it's that I had learned earlier to trust my own judgment. Because, I've wasted a lot of time, I think.
Yeah.
Thinking other people must have the answers. Why would I know? Well, why would they know? They're just, they put their pants on one leg at a time, as my husband's, football coach used to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, I thank you for sharing that vulnerability with us, because I think that people will look at you and think to themselves, multiple awards, investigative journalism, true moral compass, has really spoken out on behalf of many people from many different backgrounds. And the fact that you still have those sort of reservations internally, and you still have those sort of worries, and those sort of quote unquote normal responses to things like criticism or public shaming, whatever you want to call it, I think is really refreshing. So thank you for that.
Goodness, Ruby. I mean, that's human, right? If we all don't pretend that we, Another, well, on that journey to this, to understanding about, one should try and be indifferent to praise, as well as to people trying to crush you, is, I don't know if you have come across Susan George, but she's this remarkable woman who was on the board of the magazine I worked on in New York, called Food Monitor, and that was my big experience of looking at authority in the world of food, and she's written these extraordinary books, and yet she actually is still, she is still vulnerable. She is still having to learn to accept that when people pile in on you, it probably is it is a sign that you've done something that's worth doing. Yes, sorry, I can't remember the name of her major book. Yes. Anyway,
I'll
yes.
look it up.
What should we...
Don't worry, I'll put that in the show notes. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a bit about your own experience. Again, going back to your diagnosis around that time, you came across the anti-cancer book. I remember that book very well. A close personal friend of mine, um, whose brother-in-law actually got diagnosed with colon cancer, started using that book, and actually his own story mirrors a lot of yours. He was given a very short amount of time, and luckily, he's survived well over 10 years.
Mm.
And that was like my introduction into some of the other elements of food. I was focusing on things like cardiovascular health and metabolic health. I hadn't really looked into oncology as much as I could have. But that was like a really lovely sort of foundation for me to go into the reference section, dive into some of those studies that he'd written about, and that set me on like discovering more people. What was your experience of your treatment at that time, and how you were supporting yourself with food and lifestyle?
Well, I mean, it was. I mean, there was the level of, one thing. There was shock. I mean, the hemo oncology department at Bart's is just simply marvelous. They're wonderful. It's just beautifully organized, and they're open, and they're kind, and they just make you feel like you're being really taken care of. But you sit there, and when you're about chemotherapy, and you've got these, the bags, the needles, this poison is going into you to kill off these cells. And then these sweet people come in with a trolley. I mean, kind people, I shouldn't say sweet people. Kind people come in with this trolley, and it's laden with, Lucozade, Coke, Mars bars, crisps, every sweet snack in the world. And I was genuinely shocked and
Mm,
horrified by that, because of what I had. Well, actually, my husband was more or less reading that book to me, Anti-Cancer, and
mm,
I thought a lot of these people here are here partly as a result of that kind of stuff that has become, what is it now? 55% of our diet in the UK is ultra processed food, and
mm,
there they were handing it out. And then I heard this. There was this young man with a multiple myeloma, and he was looking pretty awful. And I heard the nurse saying to him, are you managing to eat? And and it turned out he was, he was going to the burger shop, and he was drinking a lot of Coke. And she said, well, that's fine, that's good. And then, that old thing of calories, that, and you think, no, that's not good. I mean, yes, you want to support him, and say, but you want to say, you really need to, if you can. Well, there ought to be some sort of support network for
yeah.
eating better. And
Mm,
so there was that level, and I just had to do the rest on my own, because I wasn't going to get any, apart from Kavanaugh saying, yeah, fine, I'll, you know, yes, take the curcumin. I mean, I would have done it anyway, but him saying, yes, of course, and we'll see what happens. And so then I took from that book all the advice about mushrooms. I see a really good Chinese doctor who I checked out, who was at that point teaching in the joint degree between Middlesex University and Beijing University. So I took all the advice about mushrooms, about the cabbage and broccoli, and
mm,
I upped all that, tremendously. Even though, I mean, I have a good diet anyway, but I just tried to absorb all this, the onion family. So my diet became, every bit of the onion family, every bit of the cruciform cabbage family, lots of mushrooms. But I just, I decided pleasure was as good. I didn't stop having a glass of wine with my meal unless I felt ill. But um, that I had to feel good about that food. Well, I mean, I'm a reasonable cook, so and my friends are too. So I mean, that's how I did it. I mean, I stuck with that. I just, and my friends did. So if I went round for dinner, there would be masses of broccoli done in an interesting way, um, and then but I responded really, really well on this trial. I think I'm the only person. I maybe slightly wrong. I think I'm the only person on this national trial who still hasn't had a stem cell transplant.
Oh wow.
Um, because that was part of the trial to see if you could do without, you could get to a certain level without a stem cell transplant. And touch wood, I haven't had one yet.
That's
So,
incredible. I mean, just as you were talking about this, I have to remind myself that you were privy to this information and actually putting into action. This is 10 years ago. Now, when I'm hearing all those different things, I'm thinking polyphenols, glucosinolates, indole-3-carbinol, sulforaphane, all the different brassica vegetables. When you're talking about mushrooms, I'm thinking of ergothioneine. I'm thinking about prebiotics. You're probably supporting your gut system. When even a little bit of red wine is probably the enjoyment of the red wine, as well as perhaps a little bit of some of those
hmm.
phytochemicals, even though they're in very small amounts. You've got all this beautiful collection of ingredients that we do have science, we do have information now that demonstrates the benefits to those, perhaps in a supportive manner for people undergoing things like chemotherapy and immunotherapy, which is another form of cancer therapy these days. But back then, it would have been very novel. And so you're really like do you ever look back at sort of the last 10 years of your career on the food program and all the programs you've done and just think you've really changed the conversation? You really planted the seeds for people to start talking about this in the communities that's now become mainstream.
No, I tend to concentrate on my faults and the things I haven't done really.
Okay.
um, no, I mean, no, I don't. Well, sometimes I think, yeah, I got, you have to be, that you have to be satisfied in yourself that you've done something. Yes, I did start that conversation. I think, well, there are other people. There's the World Cancer Foundation Fund.
Mm,
I mean, they've done, but journalistically, we got that conversation started. Yes,
yes.
and I'm very glad. That makes me happy that we did that. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And so so
um,
when you were doing all these things, I'm sure like you would have got a bit of funny looks maybe, or certain colleagues who might have been privy to that. How, how did you keep going? Like how did you develop that sort of sense that okay, this is what I need to be doing. This is going to be doing some benefit to me, and just to continue with it. Where did that sort of motivation, that energy come from?
I thought I was right. um, I mean, that David Servan Schreiber is a very powerful book. I mean, it's not just, as you know, it's not just sort of declaiming that this is the right thing to do. He puts together all the evidence. He was a scientist. He was a
Mm,
doctor, and I mean, that was my Bible. I give it to everyone, anyone I know who, 'cause a lot of people contact me now if they get multiple myeloma, and I always send them a copy of that because it's it just it just gives you the confidence
mm.
to do things that are really that will really help you. And so I trusted that, and I trusted Jamie Kavanagh that he was doing the best with the conventional stuff. Yeah, I don't know. My friends, I have a history of telling them weird things. When we first were one of the small group of people who broke the mad cow disease story, and
Mm.
and I remember telling my neighbors, they should be really this friend, and she that they should be careful. They don't eat processed meat. Don't eat cheap sausages. Don't eat tin stuff. Just don't eat cheap meat pies. Don't eat any of that stuff.
Mm.
And her father, who was a maths teacher at some grand public school, she asked him, and he said that was nonsense. There was no way that there was any possibility of this disease spreading to human beings. And so I thought, Oh well. I mean, they were obviously fine, but and then what we did early on. I mean, we won the Glaxo Science Prize for our a program that we made about margarine and the fats in margarines, and trying to tell people not to eat margarine, to stick with butter and olive oil, that not, and my dad, who grew up on a farm in Ireland, who'd been eating butter and cream and milk all his life, changed to margarine. And I said, "Are you mad?" And he
Yeah.
said, "No, no." He said, "I read it in the paper." He said, "No, no, it's really bad for you." And I went, "You're 80. How can you're 80?" And he died at 93. And how can how can you say that? He went, "No, I was his daughter. The newspaper
Yeah.
said that margarine was great. I mean, I
Yeah.
must say that that was one of the hardest things. People did not believe me about margarine. I did not believe us, and that was a gradual. That was a hard story to keep telling, because
Oh, I can
Vandenberg's, when
imagine.
the program that we did about that won the Glaxo Prize, they threatened us with legal action if we went ahead, because the scientists we were using, the science we were using was shoddy, it was not generally accepted, da 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 da. But we used to have a head of a department, or our head of department, and I would go to her and I'd say, we've got this letter, we've got this message from Vandenberg's lawyer, or whatever lawyer it was, and she'd say, "Well, you must be doing something right." See, that was the attitude. And the BBC legal department, were just great. They'd say, "Well, let's see, what are you going to say? Who's saying it?" And say, "Go ahead. It's fine."
Fab.
They
Fab.
didn't
I
sue
mean,
us.
so
They didn't sue us.
yeah. I mean, so again, like you've been on the right side of history because you've really gone with your gut instinct that this is right, and there is science to suggest, margarine is bad. Everyone kind of understands that now. I mean, to be fair, I remember still having conversations with people in clinic about margarines and actually how you want to use good quality cold pressed oils or good quality fats instead of the margarine hydrogenated stuff, because that idea is pervasive, and even things like avocado being bad for you, for example, because it is a calorie rich, fat rich product.
Yeah.
Those things are very, very hard to get out of the cultural mindset. And so that's a fantastic example of sort of your journalistic capabilities. I also wanted to ask you about the BSc crisis as well, because that would have been really tough as well. I imagine, essentially doing a story that could, well, it was the right thing to do, obviously, but it was obviously going to have ramifications on the economy.
Well, one of the funny things I've realized is that, because in Britain, food is seen as sort of trivial, we were able to do more radical things than if we'd been a news and current affairs program, because they were just, it's a food program, who cares about food? So we were left alone, really. And we had for a long time, we had a fabulous editor, Graham Ellis, who is now on the board of the BBC. But he took the line that, I was a senior producer then. I wasn't the presenter. It was Derek was the presenter, and he took the line that if I was a senior producer, I was meant to be competent. If I was not, if I was, messing up, then I should be fired. But otherwise, he would leave me alone, And if I needed legal advice, then ask him. But otherwise, just get on with it, make programs. And that was so freeing, really. I mean, that you had to be responsible. You didn't want to you didn't want to get the BBC in legal trouble, but you could do difficult things. And there are not enough of those kind of editors. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we have a good editor now, but I'm not directly involved in, because I'm a presenter now, and I get much more involved than many presenters do, because I've been a producer and I'm a journalist. But it's tough because the changes that Mrs. Thatcher brought about, at the BBC, this, in this becoming a highly managed organization. I mean, it was based on what she'd already done to the NHS. In my view, have not been helpful. But I still see people, producers, fantastically committed to a public service.
Yeah, yeah, and I think
Sorry, that went off.
no, no, no. What I think one of the most important conversations we need to have centers around food, because I think you're right. We do trivialize food as something that, oh, it's just like a nice thing to have on the side, a talking point, rather than the core of what we should
Mm,
be talking about. And I think, particularly with what's going on right now, with the cost of living crisis, the war, COVID, inflation, food is a central part of where we need to be directing our energy and our resources and our thinking. And health again is one of the things that we've largely ignored in the conversation around food. I wonder. I was going to ask you this a bit later, actually, but in light of how outspoken the show's been, and you've been, and how expertly you've been able to start these conversations. What are the main kickbacks that you get from doing shows on these topics? Because I get a lot of criticism for talking about food in sort of this manner as being, okay, well, this is something that only people who are well off can actually think about, and actually it should really be about yield and accessibility, and doing the best with what you have, rather than, oh, you need to have X number of vegetables, you need to have these types of foods. Like, what are
yeah.
your thoughts on that?
Well, that's the big kickback we've always had. That somehow we are a bunch of middle class chattering classes, and precisely what you've just said. But my view, it was I just was I don't know if you heard this. James Rebanks, who wrote English Pastoral, writer, farmer in Cumbria. He was one of the people over Christmas who the Today program invited to be an editor. They do that; they ask famous people. And anyway, during the Today program, he was questioned. He was interviewed by one of the normal the Today program presenters, and I was just looking at this before I started to talk to you, because I'd quoted it in a forward to the food program book, and the reporter said to Rebanks, he said, um, but there's a problem. You seem to be implying that food should be more expensive, but we need cheap food to feed the poor. And Rebank said, you don't fix poverty by making food cheaper. You fix poverty by redistributing income. What you've said is just propaganda. And the reporter just quickly changed the subject and just moved on to something really fast. And that's it. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult question, because
Hmm.
we have a very unequal society, and we have watched it becoming more unequal, and people getting paid, not getting paid enough to eat well. And, I came from a working class background where people cooked. My mother had a full time job and a very unhelpful husband. And, I'm not saying we should go back to women, women back in the kitchen, but we have to stop condescending to people from the working class and say, oh, well, they really need to eat, all this highly processed food. No, that people on low incomes know what they ought to be eating, but they don't have enough money. And
Hmm.
it's I hate the fact that in Britain, it just makes me so angry that we get attacked by people from posh middle class backgrounds. I won't name names, but as as though we're this elite that we're just talking about posh food and sourdough bread and everything that no one can afford. But they are the very people who go off to France and Greece and Italy for their holidays and relish this culture where everybody has the same food aspirations, where they eat roughly the same food. I mean, you might eat caviar at the top and you don't at the bottom, but basically you eat the same food. We don't here. We divide it by class. Why do we do that?
Hmm.
Why is food a class marker here? It's it's infuriating.
Mm.
But but as you say, with the war, the rising cost of living, it's really, really difficult. I mean, we're stuck. We are where we are,
Mm.
but we have to do something about inequality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Food, telling people that they should eat the food that makes them very sick, that makes I mean, even in pure economics, in purely selfish terms, and just let's not think about people's feelings. I mean, you know how much it costs to treat people with diabetes type 2, and you know all the things that follow from that terrible diet, all the things that happen to nature because of that diet. The way we exploit soils. I mean, we need soils. It's all that we've got on this little revolving, this bit of rock in space. We've got soil, and we think that killing it's a good idea. No, it's not.
Yeah, everything that you said, I mean, it completely resonates with me, and I think it is madness when you think about it, and purely in selfish and economic terms, it makes sense to raise the bar for food because of all those different elements. Healthcare costs alone, let alone environmental costs and everything else it can have ramifications on. So, absolutely. And I that was going to be my sort of next sort of inflection actually, because we've talked about BSE, we've talked about the margarine sort of cover ups and what big businesses and large organizations are vested in. We talked about how the knowledge around nutritional medicine is not pervasive enough in medicine. What things are we doing today that are going to have ramifications in the next 10, 20 years? I think redistribution of wealth is a big area. What are the things that we know today that we will look back on in 10 years' time and be like, wow, like how did no one know about this? How did we not sort of foresee the issues that we're dealing with today because of what we could have done before?
I mean, they're probably the things we've already touched on. I mean, the why didn't we see much earlier that we had to farm? It's now called farming regeneratively. Like,
Mm,
why we were so idiotic about sticking to this monoculture, this way of using up soil and water. Why were we so trapped in short term thinking? Why do we why do we sort of, I mean, I don't know if it came about. I mean, I'm sure human beings have always been vulnerable to short term thinking because that's the way we are. But in the I lived through the Thatcher Reagan period. That period of the where the economists, the Chicago economists, and the market would solve all our problems, and public equaled bad, and private equaled good, and greed was good, and
mm,
everything was monetized. Um, that we've, I mean, I do see people who are born you know, after 79, and who find it quite difficult to think of a world where quarterly or company reports, are they're not the measure of the way of prosperity. I mean, it seemed like we've embodied a kind of short-term thinking. I mean, I'm thinking about when PepsiCo, I mean, I'm not endorsing this as a policy, but do you remember when PepsiCo decided to take sugar, all these problems about sugar, seriously, and started moving wholesale into using artificial sweeteners? I mean, we now know
yeah.
that's not a good plan, but anyway, they did. But I don't know. It was like three subsequent quarters of a drop in profits, and they got rid of the CEO and reversed themselves. Um,
Mm.
there isn't much. I don't know. I don't know how this group think about. I mean, the monetization of life is one of the worst things that happened in my adult life. Um,
Uh-huh.
there's something distasteful, even when we do talk about what you just said about when we start monetizing nature, as though that's the only way we can get people to understand that nature is valuable, soil is valuable, water is valuable. Because it's as though we've discounted, thousands of years of human experience of that the way we feel about things matters. The way we, it isn't just money. It really isn't
Mm,
just money.
yeah.
I don't know. That doesn't answer your question properly,
No,
Rupy,
no, no,
but
no. I mean, I just spun that on you because I have thoughts on this that I need to educate myself on a bit better. But soil health, from my limited understanding of it, from speaking to farmers and speaking to people on this podcast who are privy to the information around regenerative or biodynamic, or call it what you will, it seems to me that's what we should be focusing on as an endpoint, as an outpoint of farming, rather than yield. And the yield has sort of been cloaked in this idea of, well, yield is what we need to focus on to feed the world. If
mm,
by some miracle that's going to cure poverty and cure hunger around the world. And I'm my personal belief at the moment, and I strongly believe this, but it's loosely held. And when I say loosely held, I mean I'm very happy to change my opinion if enough evidence is to the contrary of it. But I certainly believe that we don't have a yield issue; we have a distribution problem. We more than produce what we need to feed the world many times over, but we don't have the means to distribute it to people. And the other thing is in the sort of chase in the race to grow more and more, we're destroying our environment in the process. And I think there are lateral thinking ways in which we should be approaching farming in general. And I think farming is something that I need to certainly put more attention into, because without soil health, you don't have microbial health, you don't have human health, you don't have environmental health, and all of those things are connected. So that's what I think we will probably look back in 10 years' time and think, how on earth did we not take this more
yeah.
seriously?
I think there is a great deal of evidence that we produce enough food in the world right now, but it's a distribution problem. I mean, it's Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize-winning economist, who pointed out that famines do not happen because there's no food. They happen
Mm,
because people don't have the purchasing power to
mm,
buy food. There's always food. I remember during the Ethiopia famine, I could buy lentils down at Ethiopian lentils at Sainsbury's on Holloway Road. Um,
mm,
I mean, those things. But the whole agribiz industry is invested in saying we need more food, more food, more food. We have these 15 billion that are coming. We've got to keep producing, but we produce enough calories now. I mean, that yield, you're right. I mean, the yield issue just perverts our minds because this is a tiny little experiment, but a tiny little story. But I've just finished 10 days of an experiment for our next program on bread. And I'm still wearing one of these,
oh,
glucose
CGMs,
monitors
yeah,
on my arm.
yeah, yeah.
And Natalie Donovan and I, the producer, have been eating a series of supermarket breads and seeing what happened to our blood sugar. In fact, it wasn't that remarkable because both Natalie and I turn out to have very good glucose. We can metabolize it really well. So Tim Spector, who's been overseeing this experiment, Professor, Tim Spector at King's College London, the expert on the microbiome, he was very disappointed in us because he reacts very badly to supermarket bread. Anyway, but I got quite sick 2 days on this bread, and but on the last day, we both decided we would eat the highest quality bread we could get in our neighborhoods.
Mm,
So I bought a sourdough loaf made from einkorn wheat, and I had 100 grams, just like we had with all the other stuff, and I ate it dry, just like the other stuff, and I felt great, and I wasn't hungry for 4 hours. That was my breakfast and at 8:30 in the morning. and I wasn't actually that hungry at lunchtime, but it was just a very, and I could measure my blood sugar, which didn't move at all. And
Mm.
and it was just a little experiment of those things you're always saying it's really worth buying, because I felt ill on the white slice, brown slice, malted, all those. I mean, I genuinely, my gut went into, spasm. And,
Mm.
it was like, yes, quality, it's not yield. You can make a million loaves of that white slice stuff, but it won't feed you.
Mm.
Those two slices of bread fed me. They were food. And we've got confused about this. I mean, Michael Pollan calls them food-like substances. And they are food-like substances. They're not food. And we've
Mm.
got to think less about yield and more about what we're growing and how nourishing it is, as well as what's good for the soil, the planet, and so on.
Yeah. Sheila, your programs have nourished me, and they continue to inspire a lot of people. And I just, yeah, I can't. I listen to it avidly. You can listen to it on podcast now on BBC Sounds and stuff, and it's great. And the work you're doing is fabulous. And I can't wait to see you next week at the conference. It's going to be really, really interesting.
Yes,
And I'm sure you're going to meet new people there as well. I'd love to introduce you to some. There's a couple of
I'll come and
oncologists that you
find you.
probably. Yeah, please do. There's a couple of oncologists that I have had on the pod you're probably aware of. But there's some really interesting stuff going on, I think, in the world of improving access of whole foods to people who need it, and in a supportive manner. So, dehydrating things like broccoli sprouts and putting it into a powdered form and having that as an addition to a healthy diet, as well as all the other treatments that we have. I think that's definitely the future. And William Lee is going to be there as well, who's been on the podcast, who's done extensive work in both pharmaceuticals, but also food as well, food as medicine. He's a big
Yeah,
proponent of
right.
things like
I'll look him up.
mushrooms
I
and
don't know
brassica
him.
vegetables.
Yeah.
He's
Okay.
got a wonderful book as well called Eat to Beat Disease.
Oh, really?
Which is a great read. I think you'd find it's almost like the updated version of anti-cancer, because he's been privy to a lot of the research himself. So yeah, it's going to be brilliant. I think you're going to have a wonderful time, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. But thank you so much for your time, Sheila.
It's
really
been great,
it's really
Ruby. I want to say that, I know this isn't you're marvelous, you're marvelous, but you're marvelous. But honestly, you have, you give me hope. You're the rise of Doctor's Kitchen, and you and that cohort of doctors and NutriTank. I mean, you just think, yes, you're all brave, curious people, and it just cheers my life. Anyway, thanks very much, Ruby. Bye-bye.
So sweet of you. Thank you so much, Sheila. I appreciate that.